Snow exploded around them in hard white bursts, each impact punching a fist-sized crater into the drift and throwing ice chips into the air like shrapnel. "Contact front! Contact high!" someone yelled, voice ripped thin by the wind and the panic. The patrol was scattered across the shallow valley, 12 dark figures in cold weather gear suddenly far too visible against a field of blinding white. The midday sun bounced off the slopes on either side, turning the snow into a mirror. Every twitch, every flinch, every attempt to crawl to cover stood out like ink on paper. Rounds slashed down from the ridgeline to the north, coming in at an angle that felt wrong. High, raking, enfilade fire that swept left to right across the valley floor. Traces stitched bright orange arcs across the open ground, cutting over heads and into the snow with a sound like ripping cloth. Where the hell are they? Chief Rourke slammed himself behind a knee-high rock outcrop and yanked his rifle in tight. It was barely enough cover for his torso, never mind the rest of him. "Can't see," shouted Lopez, the JTC, flattening into the snow, his radio pressed against his helmet. "I've got muzzle flashes up high." But the rest of his sentence dissolved into a shriek of white noise in his headset. "Static. Havoc 2-1. Say again. Say again," he barked. "Blade. This is Havoc 2-1. Troops in contact. Grid." More static. A harsh, grinding buzz that cut across every frequency. "Comms are trashed," someone yelled. "I've got nothing on sat." "Switch to alt," Rourke snapped, reaching to his chest rig, fingers moving on muscle memory even as bullets licked at the snow near his boots. "Backup net, now." Another line of tracers whistled low and angry, carving a path directly in front of him. Somewhere off to the left a man screamed, high and abrupt, then cut off with a sickening wet sound. "Rourke, I'm hit." That was Mason, their designated sniper, voice tight. "Left side, mid-valley." Rourke risked a glance, eyes burning from the glare. He saw Mason half-hidden behind a snow hump, one leg smeared red where the snow had started drinking his blood. Mason's rifle lay a meter out of reach, its barrel partially buried. A heavy machine gun on the ridge coughed to life again, its slower, throatier rhythm distinct from the lighter rifles. The gunner walked rounds closer, line after line, sweeping across the valley like a spotlight of lethal metal. Each burst shoved the whole patrol a fraction flatter to the ground until they could barely raise their heads. "Find that gun," Rourke shouted. "I want someone to." His voice snagged as another burst chewed through the rock just above his helmet, spraying stone fragments down his neck. Sat link just went dark, Lopez snarled, slamming his fist into the snow. "We're blind. This is deliberate. Chief, someone's jamming the whole band." Rourke's pulse thudded in his ears. They were in a shallow bowl, slopes rising gently on both sides, the open mouth of the valley stretching ahead. What had looked like simple rolling terrain 30 minutes ago now felt like the inside of a rifle barrel. Another man went down trying to crawl to a slightly bigger rock. Another scream. Another stain in the snow. They were going to die here. He wasn't the only one thinking it. He heard it in the way voices rose in pitch, in the chopped, half-finished sentences on the short-range net. "Need smoke. Out. Medic, I need." The machine gun laughed over them again, a ripping chain of thunder that made any attempt at movement suicidal. Then, cutting clean through the chaos, a single new sound arrived. A crack. Not the thump of the machine gun or the chatter of the rifles, but a sharp, solitary report, distant and precise. It came from somewhere no one had accounted for, up higher, beyond the primary ridgeline, at an angle their overwatch hadn't covered because no one had thought a human being could get up there in the time they'd been on the ground. The heavy machine gun hiccupped. Stopped. Rourke blinked snow out of his eyes. The rhythm that had been walking toward him, round by round, just died. He heard someone curse in surprise in a language he didn't recognize from up on the ridge. Then a body tumbled, a small dark shape rolling down the white slope, leaving a folding trail behind it. What was that? Lopez whispered. Another crack answered him. Same direction, same controlled tone. Halfway up the opposite ridge, a man with a long antenna on his back jerked as if yanked by an invisible hook. The radio he'd been hunched over went flying, his body collapsing into the snow. "Who the hell is shooting?" Rourke demanded, scanning the high ridges, visions swimming from the bright. He couldn't see anyone, but whoever it was, they knew exactly what they were doing. A third shot, clean and unhurried, drifted down. An RPG gunner who had been skulking behind a snow berm, tube pointed toward the ball, stiffened and fell sideways. The rocket slid from his grip and harmlessly thumped into the snow. Then another shot. A figure on the ridge, the one who had been waving and pointing, directing fire, folded in half and vanished behind his cover. Rourke's mind caught up half a beat later. This wasn't random. This was a ladder. Radios. RPG. Squad lead. Whoever was up there was stripping the enemy's force multipliers one by one, like someone reaching through the chaos to flick key pieces off a board. Their own radios crackled. For a split second, between bands of interference, a new voice cut in. Calm, clear, female. "Havoc element. This is Valkyrie," it said, almost conversational. "You've got maybe 90 seconds before they untangle themselves. Stay low. Don't bunch up." Lopez's head snapped up. "Valkyrie? Who the?" "Static ate the rest. Did you get that?" Rourke yelled. Yeah, but that's not any call sign we were briefed on." Lopez shook his head. "Who the hell is Valkyrie?" Before anyone could answer, the machine gun tried to roar back to life from a slightly different angle as someone scrambled to replace the fallen gunner. Another distant crack. The gun went quiet for good. The valley turned strangely silent for a heartbeat. The only sounds were the moan of wind across the snow and the ragged breathing of men who had already seen themselves dead. No one in the bowl knew where their savior lay. They only knew that death had suddenly started working for them instead of against them. Later, much later, they would argue about who had said what on that net, about when they'd first heard the name, about how many shots there had been. But they all remembered the same voice. Steady, older, unhurried. I wasn't on the roster as a sniper that day. The voice that had cut through snow and static now filled a very different room. Overhead, fluorescent panels hummed softly. The air was still, conditioned, smelling faintly of coffee and printer toner. No wind, no gunpowder. The only snow here was in the framed photograph on the far wall, a high, white ridge under cold blue sky. Rear Admiral Catherine Pierce sat at the head of a narrow conference table, dress blues immaculate, ribbons a neat line of color over her heart. Her hair, now striped with gray, was pulled back tight. Her hands rested lightly on a folder she didn't need to open. Across from her, a handful of younger officers sat in silence. Their uniforms were equally crisp, their faces less lined. Some had not yet seen combat. Some had, but never in a place like the one in the photograph. "This isn't an official lesson," she said. "You'll get plenty of those. This is an unofficial one, about underestimating your enemy." She paused. "And yourself." One of the lieutenants leaned forward, eyes flicking to the photo on the wall again. The mountain, the white, the narrow dark smear that might have been a valley. "You were there?" he asked. Pierce's mouth twitched. "I was." Her gaze stayed on them, but her mind went somewhere else, back 10 years, to the feel of rotor wash and thin air and the weight of a rifle she supposedly had no reason to carry. The story came back not as a straight line, but as flashes. Metal under her boots. The engine howl of the helicopter as it skimmed low over jagged peaks. Ridges marching to the horizon like frozen waves. Sunlight flashing off snowfields. "Imagine that valley," she said quietly, nodding toward the photo. "But from ground level. Imagine you've just been dropped off with a dozen people who think they know exactly what kind of day it's going to be." The helicopter had been an assault bird stripped for altitude, its skin painted in a dull, non-reflective gray that matched the cliffs. The rotors beat against the thin air, each slap of the blades a heavy, slow thump. Pierce sat in the back, strapped in, helmet on, headset crackling with intercom chatter. Her rank tabs were covered, but that never fooled anyone who knew how to read the way people sat today. 5 minutes out, the crew chief shouted, hand on the overhead rail as he leaned toward the open door, scanning the white world rushing by below. Chief Rourke sat opposite her, chin tucked behind his balaclava, goggles pushed up for now. Deep creases ran from the corners of his eyes, lines etched by squinting into sun and sand and snow over too many years. He looked at her gear and said nothing, but she saw the calculation. He had a right to wonder what a flag officer was doing on his beard. Beside him, Mason cradled his rifle like it was something fragile, long barrel tucked between his knees, scope capped to keep the lens from fogging. Lopez sat closer to the tail, one hand resting on his radio pack, the other tapping a novice rhythm on his knee. "Everybody check your traction," Rourke called over the intercom. "This isn't a stroll in the park. Ice is going to be waiting to laugh at you." Pierce dropped her gaze, running eyes and fingers over her own kit. Crampons clipped to her harness. Snowshoes strapped to the pack behind her to be used when the terrain flattened. Rifle across her lap. Not the shorter carbine the others carried, but a longer weapon, old and familiar. That had been a small fight back at the forward base. "We've got carbines set up for you," someone had said, a well-meaning logistics officer almost wringing his hands. "Standard issue, lighter, you don't need." "I'll carry my own," she'd answered, and left it at that. The others thought it was sentimentality, perhaps. They weren't wrong, but that wasn't all of it. 2 minutes, the crew chief called. The world outside had unfolded into a plateau of snow-covered ridges, distances deceptive in the clear high air. It looked close enough to reach out and touch, and a world away at the same time. Pierce peered past the crew chief's shoulder. The sensor mast they were after poked up from a nearby ridge like a broken tooth, a slim vertical line against the blue. "One compromised mast," she told the young officers in the briefing room, voice overlaying the memory. "Routine maintenance site. Hard to get to, ugly in winter, but otherwise unremarkable." She let the word hang there. "Unremarkable," she repeated. We had gotten used to calling things that, until someone reminded us what that really means. A place you don't expect a fight, which is exactly where a patient enemy will put a fight. They'd been briefed in a canvas tent, maps and satellite imagery pinned to a sagging board. The air had smelled of diesel heaters and instant coffee, the murmurs of the forward base outside a soft backdrop. "The mast's been offline for longer than we like," the intel officer had said, using a laser pointer to tap a grainy image. "Signals degradation looks like more than weather. We need to get to it, pull the storage module, and either get it out or scrub it." Pierce had studied the overhead shot. A ridgeline, the mast, a shallow valley leading up to it. White everywhere. "What's in the data buffer?" she'd asked. "Coverage logs? Tasking. Some stored imagery." The officer shifted. "Enemy gets it. They might not get the raw code, but they can infer our patterns. Where and when we look, where we don't. Blind spots." She nodded. On another board, satellite coverage diagrams overlapped like petals. Bands of green and blue, indicating line of sight, intersected over the region. Some stretches were gray. "Those," she'd asked. "Temporary gaps. Orbital timing. Terrain masking. There's a window this afternoon where we'll have a blind arc for about 20 minutes along this approach route. But that's after your expected exfil time." The others had brushed past it. She hadn't. "Why that route?" she'd asked. "Why not swing wider on the north side of the spay?" Rourke had answered that one. "North side's a mess. Overhangs and avalanche risk. We keep it simple, land on the plateau, skirt the bowl, up to the mast, back the same way. Open ground but good visibility. Should be in and out before the weather moves in." On the edge of the map, a weather officer had cleared their throat. "Front still tracking in, Chief. Latest models say snow squalls possibly earlier than we thought. Whiteout conditions later this afternoon, but you should be clear if you stick to the timeline." "Copy. We'll walk faster," Rourke had said, earning a few chuckles. Pierce had not laughed. She'd looked from the coverage diagram to the predicted weather window, then to the approach route snaking through the bowl. Her fingers had tapped once on the table. "Any unusual traffic patterns in the area?" she'd asked. "Some ground movement along the lower valleys," Intel had answered. "Could be smugglers. Could be nothing. No armed convoys. No big signatures. No big signatures. No obvious threat. Unremarkable. On the plateau, the air had knifed through Pierce's clothes the moment she stepped down from a helicopter. The bird was gone in seconds, rotors flinging powder into their faces as it lifted away, then dwindling to a distant insect shape against the sky. Silence swallowed the team, the kind of silence that made you aware of your own heartbeat. "Form it up," Rourke had called, scanning the horizon with a practiced eye. "Mason, Lopez, you with me. Rest of you, stand at intervals, 5 meters, watch your spacing." They'd moved out in a staggered file, boots and crampons crunching on the crusted snow. The ridges around them rose and fell in gentle steps, each crest revealing another, like waves frozen mid-crash. Pierce's breath steamed in front of her. She walked in the middle of the line, not at the front, not at the back. An observer, by design and by choice. She watched how the younger operators walked, how they scanned. She also watched the snow. Tracks told stories. She had learned that before she ever learned to read proper words, trailing behind a father who had demanded she point out every deviation in the white back home in the winter woods. Halfway across the second ridge, she saw it. "Old," she called quietly on the internal net, more out of instinct than authority. Rourke glanced back, one eyebrow going up behind his goggles. She stepped off the line, crouching by a slope that dropped away to their right. The snow there looked normal, at a glance, smooth, wind-shaped. But near a particular outcrop there was a faint straight line, too straight to be natural, where powder had been swept aside and then dusted over again. Above that, on a steeper section, a series of marks cut a faint traverse. Not the wide, meandering pattern of a shepherd's animals. Narrow, deliberate, steep. "Somebody's been here," she said. "Locals," Lopez suggested, breath pluming. "Herders, maybe. Route up to one of those goat tracks." Pierce shook her head. "Too steep. And no return trail. Just one direction up." "So somebody went up, didn't come back down," Mason said, unconcerned. "Could have been weeks ago." "Could have," she agreed. She could almost hear her father's voice. "Then why's it still sharp? Why's the snow so clean where there should be debris?" She looked at the outcrop again. At the way the snow around it was immaculate, no bits of windblown grit or stray brush showing. "Doesn't look like it's been weathered much," she murmured. Rourke checked his wrist GPS, then the mast position on his map. "We're burning daylight. We can send a drone up later, give that line of country a second look. For now, we've got to make the mast before this where the snot's on us." She didn't push it. Part of the job, at her rank, was picking your arguments. She filed the detail away instead, a small grain of unease lodged under everything else. They moved on. As they crested another rise, the mast loomed closer, a thin spire of metal wrapped in frost. Sunlight flashed from its metallic surfaces. The sky was still a hard, clear blue, but a bruise of darker cloud was building on the western horizon. "Looks like a postcard," one of the younger operators muttered. "Yeah." Mason grinned behind his beard, shifting his rifle. "I'll send you one from the top." Pierce slipped her rifle from its sling as they paused for a quick water break. She found a rock on a distant ridge, small, dark, just at the edge of her effective range in this area. Mason asked, watching her. "Just making sure the old girl still remembers how," she said. She settled into a half-kneel, rested the rifle against her shoulder, feeling the familiar pull of its weight, the contours worn by years of use. Breath in, breath out. Let it hang. Wind coming left to right, light but persistent. The sun glared, but she'd shot in worse. The shot felt good before she even broke trigger. The recoil was a firm push into her shoulder, the crack sharp in the cold air. On the distant ridge, powdered frost jumped from the lens of rock. "Nice," Mason said, tone appreciative. "That muscle memory, huh?" She was already safing the weapon, lowering it. Something like that. She didn't explain that the distance had been intuitive, that her brain had done the math the way other people solve simple arithmetic, without conscious effort. She didn't say that it always came back, no matter how many years she ignored it. Back in the briefing room, one of the younger officers spoke up. "So you'd been a sniper before?" Pierce gave a small, almost amused snort. I've been a lot of things. None of them on my paperwork anymore. She tapped the folder under her hands once, fingers quiet. Ask yourselves, right now, what you're good at that isn't on your paperwork, she told them. Ask what part of yourselves you've quietly set aside because it doesn't fit the box you think you're supposed to live in. She let that sit for a beat, then continued. We hit the approach to the mast. There was one more thing I should have paid more attention to. She glanced back at the photo, at the ridge lines, at the shallow bowl leading up. A pattern of silence, she said softly. But I'll come back to that. The snowfield before the mast dipped gently, a long, shallow bowl that their route cut through. From above, on the satellite map, it had been a pale smear, innocuous. From the ground, it felt like a bad story she'd heard before. Looks like a sandbox, Chief, Lopez said, voice cheerful. Let's just not plant ourselves in the middle of it. Stay spread, Rourke called. Keep to the edges of the low ground, not the center. I want a little standoff from that mast in case it's booby-trapped. Mason's voice came over the net from a slightly higher spur to the left. Overwatch in position. I've got eyes on the mast. No movement. No heat signatures. Copy, Rourke said. Lopez, check me a quick bounce to blade. Let them know where. Lopez was already pressing his transmit switch. Blade, this is Havoc 2-1. Where? Static answered him. Not the soft hiss of distance, but a harsh, grinding buzz that cut across the channel, jagged and full. Lopez grimaced. Blade, say again last. Yo. The static only got worse. Terrain shadow, one of the operators guessed. Could be, Lopez allowed. We're dipping below that side ridge. Give me a sec to switch antenna configuration. Pierce listened with half an ear, more focused on the feeling in her gut. The silence had started to bother her. Too quiet. No distant animal bells. No scattered snowmobile tracks. No signs of local traffic moving through. Even though this valley would have been a natural crossing route in good weather. She scanned the slopes. Nothing. Clean, white, immaculate. Her father's voice again. What you see is one thing. What you don't see is something else entirely. Her gaze snagged on a glint. Far up on the northern ridge, something flashed, just for a second. Too linear to be rock. Not the flat panel of the mast hardware. Chief, she said, tapping her transmit. 3 o'clock high, near that triangular rock outcrop. You see anything? Rourke sighed. Mason. Checking, came the sniper's reply. Stand by. Pierce raised her own optic, tracking to where she'd seen the flash. She saw the rock. She saw the snow around it. Nothing else. Could have been glass, she said. Lens. Binoculars. Scope. Or just sun on ice, Rourke answered. Mason. Still nothing over the net. Mason. Sorry, Chief, the sniper answered. I've got the rock. Terrain's weird up there. Could be a reflection off a pocket. I'm not seeing anything shaped like a person. Pierce didn't like that. But again, time and momentum pushed. They were almost to the lowest point of the bowl now, the mast not far beyond. Lopez swore under his breath. Still nothing on sat. I'm going to. He never finished. Everything that had been waiting for them triggered at once. Radios erupted into jagged, metallic screeching, a sound that made Pierce physically flinch. Her GPS blinked, then froze, coordinates stuttering and then vanishing. In the same instant, from the northern ridge, the heavy machine gun opened fire. The first burst ripped into their point man, lifting him sideways like a puppet with a cut string. Snow exploded around him in a vicious halo of white and red. Down! Rourke bellowed. They hit the snow, every one of them. The air filled with the crack and whine of incoming rounds. The machine gun walked its fire along the trough, sweeping from left to right, kicking up fountains of snow wherever it struck. Lopez's radio pack took a round, sparks and plastic shards spitting from it. He rolled, swearing, but kept his hands over his head. Contact high, North Ridge. Mason shouted, voice sharp. Pierce tried to answer, but her own radio only hissed at her, the jamming signal chewing at the edges of every frequency. This wasn't terrain interference. This was deliberate. From elsewhere along the ridge, other weapons joined in. Controlled three-round bursts, distinct from the unpaid chaos of irregulars. These were measured, coordinated. Someone was calling this fire. Mortar, someone yelled. The first round whistled in and buzzed beyond them, on the far slope. The second landed short. Lopez's training kicked in. He counted seconds between impact and sound, mind racing to place the enemy tube. Range about 800, he shouted. They are bracketing us. A third round came in dead on. It punched into the snow just left of Mason's overwatch position, the blast tossing him backward like a rag doll. His cry came through the net, sharp, then abruptly cut as his MIC died. Snipers down, another voice called. His hit. I can see him moving, but they were pinned. Comms jammed, air support unreachable, sniper out, mortar dialed in, heavy machine gun raking their position, and the clouds now pushing over the sun, light flattening into something colder and meaner. Smoke out, someone yelled, launching a canister. A thin gray veil tried to grow between them and the ridge, but the wind tore at it. Rourke's options narrowed. Break cover and move upslope under this fire? Insane. Fall back. Nowhere to fall back to. That wasn't worse. Hold and hope the jammer had a weak spot? Hope was not a plan. He looked at the Admiral. He panted. Any bright ideas would be great right about now. Pierce's heart hammered, but her voice when it came was level. Your jammer's not magical, she said. It's physics. It is to be close enough to plant a field over us, and it has to be somewhere with line of sight to the mast footprint. She yanked her map out, jabbing at the ridgeline with a gloved finger. Look, terrain mask here. Here, if I were placing it, I'd put it on this spay. Gives me coverage of the bowl and the mast both. Even if you're right, Rourke snapped, we can't hit it. Mason's out. We can't even see it. You can't, she agreed. She could. Another mortar round crashed in, spraying them with ice and rock. Lopez screamed as a shard of shrapnel tore through his sleeve into his arm. The medic crawled toward him, kit clamped between his teeth, cursing the whole way. Overhead, the clouds thickened, wind picking up, driving strings of snow into their faces. Visibility shrank by degrees. The enemy had chosen their moment well. They were buying time. Time to do something else while this patrol died slowly in the bowl. The answer hit Pierce with the clarity of a cold plunge. They're not just trying to kill us, she said. They're trying to hold us here. Keep us fixed. Rourke met her eyes bleakly. Why? So they can get to that mast, she said. Strip it. Blow it. Walk away with our patterns in their pocket. Another round slammed in close enough to rattle her teeth. Chief, one of the operators yelled, we're almost out of smoke. I've got 2 rounds left for the grenade launcher. Maybe 1 mag live in the team. We can't sit here. All eyes flicked to Mason's position. Blood streaks in the snow. The rifle lying a little ways away. The man who'd been a long arm on this mission, now curled in on himself, trying not to bleed out. No one else had the altitude. No one else had the angle. Unless Pierce's gaze drifted up, past the bowl, to the spur she'd pointed it on the map. Steep, nasty, choked with rock and snow. A route no sane person would consider under fire. She considered it. The storm rolled slowly overhead, dimming the world by another shade. Someone has to get out of this bowl, she said. Chief Rourke glared at her like she'd suggested they flap their arms and fly. That climb is suicide, he snapped. You'd be exposed the whole way. They'd chew you apart before you got 10 meters up. Not if they are focused on us, Pierce replied. Which they are. They think we already fixed. This bowl is their problem set. She tapped the map again, tracing the gully she'd mentally mapped earlier. There's a gully here, she said. Steep, but cut in. Give some dead ground. If someone can make it up to that slot, they'll have eyes on the jammer, the machine guns, maybe even the mortar team. Take those out, and your odds down here change. Someone, Lopez muttered. He grimaced as the medic cinched a bandage tight on his arm. Who exactly is someone? A fresh burst from the ridge forced them all lower. Snow kicked into the air inches from Pierce's boots. Not happening, Rourke growled. We hold. We wait for whatever air asset shakes free from this damn jammer. There's no asset coming if we don't crack that jammer. Pierce cut in, sharper than she'd intended. He rounded on her. You are a flag officer. I am not losing you on a mountain because you decided to play hero. Due to the goggles and balaclavas, most of their faces were hidden. But Pierce could feel every eye on her. They all knew the math. They all knew their odds if nothing changed. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. You're not losing a flag officer, she said. You're losing a patrol in this bowl and probably that mast. And when you do, the enemy will know more about our coverage than they should. They'll know how long it takes us to respond, how we approach, and they'll roll that into their next ambush for some other unit, in some other valley. She met his gaze and held it. If I can get up there and take the cork out of the jammer, your people get a chance to live and that mast doesn't become their prize. That's not heroics, Chief. That's triage. He looked like he wanted to keep arguing. Another mortar round landed near Lopez and the medic, sending both spinning in the snow. The medic cried out, hand going to his leg. Damn it, Rourke breathed. Nobody else volunteered. Not because they were cowards, but because they were bleeding, pinned, or too needed where they were. Pierce reached toward Mason. He stared up at her, face pale under the smears of blood and soot. What are you doing? He mumbled. Borrowing this, she said gently, fingers closing around the sniper rifle stock. His hand shot out, grabbing her sleeve. Scope's dialed for my eye. Wind, elevation. You're gonna have to. I'll manage, she said softly. He searched her face like he was trying to see something hidden under the ice. You know this gun? He asked. I know guns, she said. Not an answer, not really, but there wasn't time for a better one. She took the rifle, the magazines that hadn't been shredded by shrapnel, checked the chamber as habit. The weight settled into her hands like it had never left. Her father standing over her in the woods, breath clouding in the air. The slap of winter against her cheeks. The way he made her take shots until her fingers were numb, until the world narrowed to breath, sight, trigger. Don't think of it as killing, he'd said. Think of it as solving a problem. The target is the problem. Solve it clean. She had spent a career trying to be something other than that. Cover me as much as you can, she told Rourke. Make them look at you. Not up there. You will stay low, he hissed. You will not do anything stupid with my sniper rifle. She almost smiled. Stupid would be staying here. He clenched his jaw, then gave a single, hard nod. Lopez, he barked, get me whatever's left of that smoke and put it between us and that ridge. Everyone else, ration your rounds. But when I say light him up, you give those bastards something to think about. Pierce took one last look at the bowl, at the men scattered like broken toys in the snow, at the mast now looming closer and yet completely out of reach. Then she turned and started for the gully. The entrance to it was a narrow, shadowed cut in the side of the ridge, barely wide enough for a human body and gear. It slashed upward at an ugly angle, filled with powder and hidden ice, broken by protruding rocks. Bullets streaked through the air around its mouth, snapping past her ears. But as she slipped into the slot, the rock walls closed around her like cold hands, muting the outside roar. The sound of the battle dulled, becoming a distant storm. Her own breath grew loud in her ears. She planted her crampons carefully, testing each step before committing. The slope was brutal. One slip would send her skidding back down into the open, an easy target. Halfway up, just as she was starting to find a rhythm, one crampon slipped on a patch of ice. Her foot slid sideways, boots scraping, snow spilling off the lip of the gully. She slammed her shoulder into the rock, teeth knocking together. The rifle swung and smashed against the stone with a metallic crack. She froze, heart punching. Slowly, she pulled the weapon back in front of her, checking the optic. A thin spiderweb of fractured coating marred one edge of the lens. Not good. Not fatal. Check wind. Check rifle. Check line of sight, she muttered to herself, her father's training reproposed as a mantra. Her hands were shaking. Not from the cold. She hung there for a moment, pressed to the rock, and understood, with absolute clarity, that if she failed, men she knew by name would die in that bowl below. That her career, her rank, every board she'd ever sat, every speech she'd ever given, none of it would matter a damn thing compared to this climb and what she did at the top. Fear clawed at her throat. Not fear of being shot. She'd made peace with that odds years ago. This was fear of being exposed, of stepping back into an identity she had spent years deliberately abandoning. You're not that anymore, she'd told herself, each time she'd turned down a billet that would have used those skills. You're a strategist, a leader, a policymaker. But the snow did not care about her carefully curated identity. The enemy on the ridge did not care. The Mars did not care. Her men cared whether or not she solved the problem. She named the fear, quietly, inside her own head, gave it shape. It steadied. Then she moved. Step by step, she climbed. The sounds of the fight shifted with her angle, sometimes louder when the gully opened a little, sometimes barely audible when the rock wrapped closer. Every few meters, she hugged the wall and listened for new patterns in the enemy fire. They hadn't noticed her yet. Either that, or they were too busy hammering the ball to spare rounds for some ghost on a cliff. That wouldn't last. As she neared the top, the throat of the gully broadened just enough for her to slide sideways onto a small ledge. There she lay flat, chest heaving, pulse thunderous in her ears. The world above the rim was a hard white glow. The sky had gone from brilliant blue to a paler, more hostile color as clouds thickened. Fine snow began to drift down, dusting her sleeves. She rested her cheek against the rock for a heartbeat, letting her breathing slow. Fear sat with her, a quiet presence instead of a suffocating one. "All right," she whispered. "Let's solve the problem." She eased forward, belly-crawling the last few meters. The rock ahead dipped just enough to give her a firing slit between two outcroppings, a narrow view of the world beyond. She pushed the rifle through it, careful not to widen the hole, and looked down her cracked optic at the geometry of the trap below. And for the first time, she saw the whole thing. From her perch, the enemy positions popped out with brutal clarity. Snow berms meticulously carved into shooting platforms along the northern ridge. At least 2 machine gun nests, one now abandoned with the gun half-cocked and a dark stain beside it, the other alive and chattering. Clusters of riflemen tucked behind rocks. A small crew lower down, huddled around a compact generator with a tangle of cables snaking into the snow. A jammer, just where she'd expected. Behind them, further upslope, she saw the faint outlines of a mortar pit, tube-angled, crew working like a well-oiled machine, feeding rounds from a crate. A few figures with ropes and climbing gear waited along a side spur, poised to descend and cut off any escape from the ball. They had built themselves a perfect kill box. She checked her magazines. Not many. Enough, if she was disciplined. Not enough, if she wasn't. The optic's cracked edge bit into part of her view, distorting it. She shifted slightly so the damaged portion covered a section of empty sky instead of anything important. The rest of the glass was clear. She breathed in. Out. Target ladder. First, the jammer operator. Kill the cork in the bottle. Second, the enemy sniper. She found him tucked behind a rock with a long rifle, scope searching, looking for targets flinching down below. Third, the machine gun that had been sweeping the bowl. Fourth, the mortar observer, the one with binoculars and a radio, adjusting the rounds dropping in. Then RPG teams, squad leaders, anyone who multiplied the enemy's effectiveness. She could almost hear her father approving. Knock out the brain and the nerves. The rest is just meat. Down in the bowl, Rourke and the others were still pinned. Return fire sporadic, smoke drifting thin across the snow. She had minutes, maybe less. She settled the crosshays just off the jammer operator's head, accounting for wind, distance, the thin air. The man was bent over his device, gloved fingers adjusting dials, oblivious. Breath in. Pause. Trigger. The shot cracked, the recoil pushing back against her shoulder, familiar as an old handshake. Through the scope, she watched the operator jerk and collapse sideways, a red halo blooming in the snow. A second figure lunged toward the machine, shocked and reaching. Pierce shifted, fired again. The bullet punched through the second man's chest, slamming him backward into the generator. He fell, cables whipping free. Down in the bowl, a scrap of clear audio fluttered back into life in Pierce's ear. "Copy. I say again. Havoc 2-1, you are. Then the jammer's residual signal sputtered and went out entirely. Lopez, Rourke shouted on the net. Tell whoever that is that if they've got anything with wings in the next 10 miles, now'd be a great time. Pierce didn't wait to listen. She was already swinging her scope toward the enemy sniper. He was good. He had chosen a solid position and was watching the ball carefully, seeking any movement. He'd seen something, too. His muzzle was creeping toward the area where Rourke and the medic clustered. She cut him off mid-search. One shot. The man's head snapped back, a mist of red against white, and he slumped into his own nest. The nearest machine gun was next. Its gunner was screaming something at his assistant, slapping the feed belt. They were trying to find the source of the sudden new threat. Pierce put a round into the gunner's chest, right above the armor line. He arched, screamed once, then toppled. The assistant grabbed for the handles, trying to muscle the weapon back into action, but his rhythm was off. Bursts wild, arc no longer tight. Down below, Rourke seized the moment. Move, he roared. Drag him. Get those casualties to the left side rocks. The squad surged, snow spraying as they hauled their wounded toward cover they hadn't dared reach before. The enemy was no longer a unified fist. She could see confusion rippling down the ridgeline. Figures pointed in different directions. Some fired toward the bowl, others toward her ledge, guessing. They adapted quickly, though. She saw the mortar crew pause, the observers scanning with frantic energy, trying to spot the new shooter. A few of the riflemen below him began to move along the slope, angling toward the base of her gully. Climbers. If they got under her and came up, she'd be in trouble. She shifted the scope to the mortar observer. He was shouting into his radio, hand raised, counting. She didn't have a clean shot yet. Snow gusted, blurring her view. The clouds had thickened, the light flattening into a colorless haze. Fine flakes drifted across the lens. The world was starting to close down. She made a quick adjustment in her mind. New priority, drone operator. She heard it before she saw it. The low whine of small rotors, distinct from the wind. The drone rose from behind a rock, small and dark, camera eye scanning. If it found her, the enemy's life just got much easier. She followed the line back, searching for the operator. There, a man hunkered behind a low berm, controller in his gloved hands, antenna upright. She exhaled, held, and squeezed the trigger. The round slammed through his chest and into the tablet. Plastic, glass, and blood erupted. His hands flung wide, the controller spinning into the snow. The drone wobbled, lost input, and nosedived, slamming into a cliff face and showering fragments that tumbled down the slope. Someone fired back at her, a near miss smashing into the rock inches from her face. Chips stung her cheek. She ducked instinctively, heart hammering. They'd roughly triangulated her now. Bullets pocked the edge of a firing slit, sending small avalanches of snow down. She flattened herself, waiting out a burst, then rolled a few inches to the side into a slightly different notch. The vantage was worse, angle narrower, but it kept her alive. She checked her magazines. Half empty. The math got meaner. Down in the bowl, she saw movement. Rourke and his team had reached a tighter cluster of rocks, dragging Mason and the medic with them. Lopez was on his knee, radio pressed to his helmet, shouting, "Blade, this is Havoc 2-1. We've been jammed, heavy contact, grid." His voice broke as he transmitted coordinates. Unknown shooter assisting from High Ridge. Say again. Unknown shooter assisting. A pause. Then, incredulous. What do you mean you don't have anyone up there? Pierce didn't listen to the reply. She was watching the mortar team again. The observer had changed tactics. No longer relying on pure visual spotting, he now fired, counted, adjusted by pattern, using the bowl's average as his guide. It was cruder, but still dangerous. The light continued to die. The world slid from high noon into a strange twilight, even though the clock claimed it was still early afternoon. The incoming front was moving faster than forecast, clouds thick with snow. Visibility shrank. Muzzle flashes became islands of light in a sea of gray. She wiped her lens with a gloved thumb, careful not to smear what clarity she had. The cracked edge of the glass caught the faint glow in odd ways, but the crosshairs still floated true in the intact section. She watched the mortar observer. He raised his arm. The crew dropped another round down the tube. The wump drifted up to her a heartbeat later. She closed her eyes briefly, counting. 1, 2, 3. The round detonated in the bowl, too far left. He gestured, adjusting. Another round. Another count. 1, 2. Too short. He corrected again, making small hand motions. She studied his body language, the angle of his head, the direction of his partial turn. He was using the mast as a reference, bracketing. The next round came in closer to the cluster of rocks where Rourke's team was sheltering. He smiled, a small triumphant curl of his mouth. She took that personally. The gusting snow reduced her visual detail. His outline blurred at the edges. She couldn't see his face anymore, just the block of his body, the way he leaned in. She didn't have a perfect picture. She had timing, pattern, sound, silhouette. She let him call for the next round. Let him raise his arm, lips forming the word that would doom the men below if he got it right this time. The mortar crew dropped the round. She felt more than heard the hollow thunk. She counted. 1. She exhaled, letting her body go loose. 2. She adjusted up a hair, over his right shoulder. The wind gusted, then eased. 3. She broke the trigger. The shot cracked. She couldn't see the bullet's flight. She could only track the result. The mortar round never finished its count. It detonated off to the side, wild and useless, showering empty snow. The observer's silhouette jerked. His arm, still raised, snapped back as if punched. He toppled sideways into the mortar pit, crashing into his own crew. The tube shifted, angle ruined. One of the crew scrambled to help him and saw the blood, realized. Panic fled. They shouted to one another in confusion. The mortar fell silent. Down in the bowl, there was a second of stunned quiet. Then Rourke moved again. Now, he roared. We're not waiting for them to get clever again. Lopez, last smoke, on my mark. Everyone else, we're going for the exit of this bowl. You hear me? We're going home. Smoke blossomed, thicker this time thanks to the lack of wind at ground level. It poured into the low spaces, making a ragged curtain between them and the ridge. Pierce shifted her aim to an RPG team she spotted trying to angle for a shot on the fleeing patrol. She clipped the gunner as he took a knee, the tube slewing skyward as it fired, the rocket wobbling harmlessly into open air. Her magazines were almost dry now. She picked her targets with brutal selectivity, a squad leader shouting and gesturing, rallying his men against the suddenly surging patrol below. A climber who'd gotten too close to the base of her gully. Another leader further along, trying to get a machine gun back into a commanding position. Each fell. Each shot widened the enemy's confusion. They began to fracture. Some fired blindly into the smoke. Others started to fall back toward the mast, revealing their priorities. A few broke entirely, sliding down the back slope into the hidden valleys beyond, trying to disengage before whatever air asset Lopez had requested arrived. Her last shot took the heaviest hitter she could see, a man who carried himself different, posture straight even under fire. He stood near the machine gun nest, barking orders, headset on. Commander! The round caught him mid-turn. He folded silently. The effect rippled. Without that central voice, the enemy's fire lost coherence. What had been a well-oiled kill box dissolved into scattered, individual fights. Pierce's bolt came back on an empty click. She exhaled, long and slow. In the bowl, dark figures moved through snow and smoke, stumbling but upright, dragging others. They reached the far lip and disappeared over it, out of the line of direct fire. Somewhere in the distance, faint but growing, she heard the thrum of rotor blades fighting the storm. She let her face sink into the crook of her arm for half a second, eyes closing. She had not come up here to be a sniper. She had come because she was the only one who both understood the trap and had the particular, uncomfortable skill set to break it. Call it whatever you want, she thought. They are alive. Now she just had to get off this ridge before the storm sealed it like a tomb. The extraction, taken on its own, would have been a story too, The scramble to secure a makeshift landing zone near the mast, the wall of white the helicopters had to push through, the frantic loading of wounded into skids. As wind tried to tear them away, Pierce remembered it in flashes. Rourke's hand hauling her bodily into the bird. Mason's pale face as a medic worked over his leg. Lopez grimacing, arm trussed up, still arguing with someone on the net about air tasking. What stuck more were the details afterward. On the ridge near the mast, just before the birds arrived, they found the enemy's parting gifts. Satchel charges wired to the mast base, timing devices set but not yet armed. Data taps clipped onto the mast cable trunk, their small indicator lights blinking lazily. Evidence that someone had planned to not just destroy, but learn. They knew exactly where this mast was, the intel officer would say later in the debrief, and exactly how long it would take to get to it, once it went dark. Later still, when signals analysis came in, the story sharpened further. The enemy had intercepted fragments of planning traffic days before the mission. Nothing obvious, nothing that screamed ambush me. Just enough to know a patrol would come by a certain path at a certain window in the coverage. So they had built a trap, not to annihilate a patrol, though they were willing to test response times, to grab a high-value target if possible, to record footage of a captured American officer on their knees in the snow, in front of a burning mast, full broadcast. They almost got everything they wanted. Almost. The field debrief took place in a drafty, plywood-walled room back at the forward base. Men sat on folding chairs, some with bandages, some with 4 lines still taped to their arms. The air smelled of antiseptic and sweat and instant coffee again. "Let's talk about the ghost on the ridge," the intel officer said dryly, standing before a projected image of the valley. Who here saw them? Hands went up, some hesitant, some firm. "What did you see?" he asked. "Nothing, so," one operator admitted. "Just impacts. People dropping. Someone was up there, but couldn't say who." "Same," Lopez said. "I heard a call sign on the net, Valkyrie, but I thought maybe Haya had tasked some overwatch we didn't know about." Rourke snorted. "Haya didn't have anyone up there but us." The officer's eyes went past them, to where Pierce stood in the back, hands clasped behind her, expression neutral. She gave him a small nod. "Admiral Pierce was in the bowl with you," the intel officer said. Heads turned. Some eyes widened. "That was you," Lopez blurted, half rising from his chair. Pierce shrugged one shoulder. "I was the one who climbed." Mason supplied the rifle. All at once, the room shifted. Conversations cut off. Someone whispered, "Holy," and then caught themselves. Mason, his leg in a brace, stared at her. You knew your way around that gun," he said. "I thought maybe you'd shot before. But that wasn't just before. That was a ladder." "I had a good vantage," she replied. With respect," Rourke said, voice rough. "You went up a cliff under fire and took apart an entire line of—" She held up a hand gently. "Chief, I know what I did." He shut his mouth, but the look in his eyes had changed. It wasn't the deference he'd shown a flag officer earlier. It was something sharper, respect tinged with something like awe, and a little anger that he'd misread her. One of the younger operators who'd barely spoken until now asked the question that had been hanging since the valley. "Why didn't you tell us," he said, "that you could do that?" She thought about her father, about the smell of gun oil and pine sap, about the way he'd always praised her groups on the steel plates but never, ever asked whether she wanted to be that good. "I spent a long time trying not to be defined by one thing I was scariest good at," she said. "Trying to move into jobs where nobody would ever ask me to get behind a rifle again. I thought that was growth. Maturity. Evolution." She looked around the room, meeting each gaze. "I was wrong, at least in part. You don't get to throw away pieces of yourself just because they make you uncomfortable. You find a way to integrate them. Or one day, you find yourself in a valley that needs all of you, and you hesitate." She let that sink in. "And that hesitation," she said softly, "gets people killed." No one spoke after that. There wasn't much to say. In the present-day briefing room, the younger officers sat very still. You said there was a detail everyone ignored that morning. One of them ventured. Something you only realized later. Pierce nodded once. The pattern of silence. She flipped open the folder at last, more for effect than necessity, and pulled out a print of the coverage diagrams they'd used that day. We were looking at what was there, she said. Green areas, blue areas. Overlaps. We weren't looking at the gray. We weren't asking why certain routes had less observed traffic, why we didn't see any civilian patterns that we usually do. We wrote it off as winter, as unremarkable. She tapped a gray band crossing near the mast. The enemy used our attention against us. They placed themselves in the spaces we assumed were empty, the blind arc the satellites gave them, the quiet valley the locals had been subtly avoiding. If I had listened harder to what I wasn't seeing, if I had pushed the question instead of filing that unease away, we might have chosen a different route. We might have gone heavier, or not gone at all. She looked up. So when you plan, she told them, you ask about the noise, yes. But you also ask about the silence. What routes never get used? What frequencies are always quiet except for sudden bursts? What parts of the map everybody's eyes slide off of without noticing? She closed the folder. And you ask yourself what parts of you've tried very hard not to look at, she added. Because one day, the thing you've buried is exactly the thing that could save someone's life. One of the lieutenants hesitated, then asked the question gently. Do you regret it? Taking that rifle up there? She thought of Mason's leg, still bearing scars. Of the men who hadn't come back from that valley at all. Of the nights afterward, lying awake with the memory of each shot replaying, faces fixed behind her eyes. I regret that it was necessary, she said. I regret that our planning left us blind enough that a single person with a rifle made that much difference. I regret the people we lost because I didn't see the pattern soon enough. She looked down at her hands, then back up at them. But I don't regret climbing, she said. I don't regret solving the problem that was in front of me with the tools I had, even if one of those tools was something I'd hoped I'd never need again. She let her gaze drift briefly to the photo of the ridge. I didn't go up there to be a sniper, she said quietly. I went up there to bring my people home. She stood, the chair leg scraping softly on the floor. You won't get to choose every label people put on you, she said. They'll call you what makes sense to them. Hero, coward, sniper, tourist, whatever. She paused at the door, hand on the handle. Just don't let them call it luck, she said. You'll know how hard you work for every shot you take, whether it's on a ridge, in a planning room, or in whatever fight you end up in. Own that. Learn from it. And for God's sake, pay attention to the silence. The door closed behind her with a soft click, leaving the young officers alone with a photo of the white mountains and the echo of her words.